The candles had barely been lit when the first scream of laughter cracked across the ballroom, and Julian Ashworth already knew the night would end in trouble. He stood near the tall windows of Faircross Hall, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, watching the crowd part like water around a name that was on every tongue that evening. Miss Cordelia Whitmore had arrived. She moved through the room the way a flame moves through dry grass, quick, bright, impossible to ignore. Golden curls, a gown the color of ripe cherries, a laugh that turned heads 3 rooms away. Julian had heard of her beauty long before he had seen it. Now that he had, he understood why grown men made fools of themselves over her. He intended to be one of those fools. Or rather, he intended to appear as one, while remaining entirely in control. Julian Ashworth had a reputation, and he had built it carefully. Handsome, unmarried, restless, and utterly uninterested in settling down, he had spent the last 4 years breaking hearts across 3 counties, with a kind of practiced ease that made mothers lock their daughters indoors when his carriage rolled past. He did not chase women because he loved them. He chased them because the chase amused him, because it was the only thing that made the long, empty seasons of his life feel like they had a purpose. And tonight, the purpose wore cherry red and laughed like sunlight. There was also the matter of Lord Peter Ellison, a stiff, self-important young man who had been courting Cordelia for 2 months and boring the entire county with talk of his prize horses and his father's title. Julian did not particularly want Cordelia. He wanted to see Ellison's face when she chose someone else. He crossed the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been refused. Miss Whitmore. He bowed low enough to be charming, not so low as to seem eager. I confess I have been standing in this corner for the better part of an hour, trying to decide whether you are real or whether someone has hung a portrait in the middle of the dance floor. Cordelia's laugh rang out, delighted. Mr. Ashworth, I have heard a great deal about you. All of it true, I am afraid. Even the scandalous parts? Especially those. She laughed again, and around them, heads turned, whispers began, and Julian felt the familiar, satisfying click of a trap closing exactly as he had planned it. He did not notice, at first, the young woman standing several feet behind Cordelia, half hidden by the shadow of a large potted fern, wearing a gown of plain gray that had clearly been remade from an older dress rather than bought new. She held a folded shawl over one arm, the kind of shawl a companion carries for a lady who might grow cold, and she watched the exchange between Julian and Cordelia with an expression that was neither jealous nor bitter, only quietly, endlessly tired. This was Margaret Whitmore. Meg, to the very few people who bothered to use her given name at all. Cordelia's younger sister, though anyone glancing between them would never have guessed it. Where Cordelia was golden and bright, Meg was plain, brown-haired, unremarkable in every way society had decided mattered. She had learned long ago that rooms did not turn to look at her, and she had stopped minding, mostly, the way one stops minding a small ache that never fully goes away. She was 17 the first time a man looked straight through her at a ball, as though she were a piece of furniture in his way, and she was 23 now, and nothing had changed except that she had grown better at not caring. Their father, Sir Edmund Whitmore, was somewhere near the card tables, his health poor and his fortune poorer, though few outside the family knew how poor it truly was. It was Meg who managed the household accounts. It was Meg who wrote the letters to creditors, who negotiated with the butcher, who sat up nights with her father when his cough grew bad, who made certain her sister always had a new gown for every ball, while her own dresses were turned and returned until the fabric grew thin. Cordelia never asked how any of it was paid for. Cordelia never asked much of anything, except that the world continue admiring her, which it always, obligingly did. Meg did not resent her sister, not exactly. She had simply stopped expecting anything different. She was watching Julian Ashworth bow over Cordelia's hand, thinking privately that he had the look of a man who enjoyed hunting more than he enjoyed the catch, when a servant crossed too near her with a tray of drinks, and she stepped back quickly to avoid being struck, directly into the path of a gentleman moving the other way. "Careful," Julian said, catching her elbow without quite looking at her, his attention still half on Cordelia across the room. "You nearly went into the fern." "Thank you," Meg said. "I am quite capable of avoiding a plant, generally." Something in her dry tone made him actually look at her, briefly, the way a man glances at a clock, noting the time before returning to whatever mattered more. "My mistake. Are you enjoying the evening, Miss Whitmore?" she said. "Margaret Whitmore." His brow rose, just slightly. "Whitmore. Any relation to—" "Her sister," Meg said. before he could finish the question she had heard 1,000 times, in 1,000 ballrooms, always ending the same way. Yes. I did not realize Miss Whitmore had a sister. Very few people do, Meg said, and there was no self-pity in it, only a flat honesty that seemed to catch him off guard. If you will excuse me, I believe my sister will want her shawl before the night grows cold. She feels the cold terribly. I do not seem to notice it at all. She walked away before he could answer, leaving Julian standing there with the odd, unfamiliar sensation of having been dismissed by a woman he had not even meant to speak to. He recovered quickly. There was a beauty across the room waiting to be charmed, and a rival to be humiliated, and neither of those things had anything to do with a plain girl in a gray dress who smelled faintly of lavender and spoke as though she found the whole world mildly amusing from a great distance. He put her out of his mind, almost entirely. The evening carried on as such evenings always did. Julian danced with Cordelia twice, the second time drawing a sharp look from Lord Ellison across the room that gave him a satisfaction he was slightly ashamed of, though not ashamed enough to stop. Cordelia flirted beautifully, laughed at all his jokes whether or not they were clever, and told him about her love of dancing, her love of Bath in the summer, her love of a great many things that all seemed, upon closer inspection, to be love of being seen enjoying them. He found himself, more than once, glancing toward the edges of the room, where Meg stood quietly refilling her sister's lemonade, retrieving a dropped fan, murmuring something to an elderly aunt who seemed genuinely fond of her in a way no one seemed fond of Cordelia. Meg moved through the ball like a servant, though her name and her blood said she was a lady. No one asked her to dance. She did not appear to expect it. Near the end of the evening, Sir Edmund had a coughing fit severe enough to draw concerned looks from nearby guests, and it was Meg, not Cordelia, who crossed the room instantly, kneeling by his chair, pressing a handkerchief into his hand, speaking to him in a low, steady voice until the color returned to his face. Cordelia remained by the dance floor, distracted by an admirer, glancing over only once with mild concern before turning back to her conversation. Julian watched the whole thing from across the room, and for reasons he could not entirely name, it stayed with him longer than anything Cordelia had said all evening. When the carriages began arriving to collect guests, Julian found himself near the entrance hall as the Whitmore family prepared to leave. Cordelia swept past him with a final, dazzling smile, and a promise that she would be at the Hartleys' garden party next week, should he care to attend. He assured her he would not miss it for the world. Meg came last, helping her father down the front steps with a careful hand under his elbow, the plain gray shawl now wrapped around her own shoulders against the night air, since her sister had taken the good one for the carriage ride home. As she passed him, Julian said, without quite planning to, "Miss Whitmore." She paused, surprised he had spoken to her twice in one evening. "Mr. Ashworth, you should attend more balls," he said. "You have a rather unusual way of looking at things." Something flickered across her face, too quick for him to read clearly. Not pleasure, not quite, but something close to it, quickly suppressed, as though she had trained herself long ago not to hope for compliments that would only vanish by morning. "I attend every ball my sister attends, Mr. Ashworth," she said. "I simply do not expect anyone to notice." She continued down the steps before he could respond, guiding her father into the waiting carriage with practiced gentleness, and Julian stood in the doorway of Faircross Hall long after the Whitmore carriage had disappeared into the dark, turning her words over in his mind and feeling, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, faintly unsettled by a woman who had not tried to charm him at all. He told himself it meant nothing. He had a beautiful woman to pursue, a rival to defeat, and a season of pleasant conquest ahead of him. He did not yet understand that the ordinary-looking woman in the gray shawl had already done what no celebrated beauty in 3 counties had managed in 4 years. She had made him think. His friend Henry Colton found him still standing there, coat half-buttoned against the chill, staring at an empty drive. "You look like a man who has lost a wager," Henry said, amused. Was the fair Miss Whitmore not everything the county promised? "She was precisely everything the county promised," Julian said. "That is rather the trouble with her." Henry laughed, not understanding, and clapped him on the shoulder, and the two of them walked to their own carriage discussing horses and cards and nothing at all of consequence, and Julian let the conversation carry him, grateful for something ordinary to think about. But later that night, lying awake in his own bed while the house settled into silence around him, it was not Cordelia's cherry-red gown or her bright laugh that returned to him. It was a plain gray shawl, offered to a father instead of kept for warmth, and a pair of steady eyes that had looked at him without the smallest flicker of longing, as though he were simply a man standing in a doorway and nothing more remarkable than that. No woman had ever looked at him quite that way before. He found, to his own quiet surprise, that he wanted her to look at him that way again. He decided, as sleep finally began to take him, that it meant nothing at all. Margaret Whitmore was plain, and quiet, and entirely beside the point of the season he had planned for himself. Cordelia was the beauty. Cordelia was the prize. Cordelia was the reason he had come to Faircross Hall in the first place, and the reason Lord Ellison's face had gone tight and pale every time Julian had claimed her hand for a dance. He had a plan, and the plan did not include a forgotten sister in a borrowed shawl. He would later understand, already wrong about nearly everything that mattered. The letter arrived 3 days after the ball, and Meg recognized the trouble in it before she had even broken the seal, because trouble was the only kind of letter that ever came to the Whitmore house anymore. She read it standing in the cold morning light of the study, her father asleep upstairs, exhausted from another night of coughing, and her stomach sank steadily with every line. The tenant farm at the eastern edge of their land had failed again. The rents due at quarter day would not be enough to cover what was owed to the bank, and the bank's patience, the letter made clear in polite, merciless language, was not unlimited. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept the others like it, a growing collection of quiet disasters her father knew nothing about, because his heart could not take the worry, and his lungs could barely take the air as it was. She had just finished writing a careful, pleading reply, when Cordelia swept into the study in a cloud of rosewater, already dressed for the day though it was barely past 9, her face bright with news. "He is calling on us today," Cordelia announced, dropping into the chair opposite the desk as though she owned it, which, Meg thought privately, she rather behaved as though she did. "Mr. Ashworth, he sent word this morning. Meg, you must help me decide what to wear. The blue, do you think, or the primrose?" "The blue," Meg said, without looking up from her ledger. "It suits your coloring better in daylight. You always know these things." Cordelia said it lightly, the way she said most things, without any real weight of gratitude behind it, the way one thanks a servant for opening a door. "Papa must not tire himself today. If Mr. Ashworth calls and Papa has one of his coughing spells in front of him, it will look very ill indeed." "I will see that he rests," Meg said, and did not point out that she always saw to such things, that she had been seeing to such things since she was 15 years old, and their mother had died and left the household, quietly, and without anyone ever formally deciding it, in her hands. Julian arrived at 2 o'clock precisely, dressed with the careless elegance of a man who never had to think about the cost of his coat, and Meg watched from the hallway as her sister greeted him in the drawing room with a warmth that seemed, to Meg's practiced eye, only about half genuine. Cordelia liked being pursued far more than she liked the pursuer, a distinction Meg suspected Julian Ashworth had not yet discovered. The visit went the way such visits always went. Cordelia laughed, Julian complimented, tea was poured, and Meg moved quietly through the edges of the room, refilling cups, ensuring the fire did not smoke, and generally making certain the whole performance ran smoothly, without anyone noticing the hand that ran it. It was nearly an hour into the visit when Sir Edmund, against Meg's wishes, insisted on coming down to greet their guest, and made it only halfway through a single sentence of welcome before a coughing fit seized him so violently that he had to grip the doorframe to keep from falling. Cordelia rose, alarmed, uncertain what to do, her hands fluttering uselessly near her own throat as though the sight of illness might somehow catch. It was Meg who crossed the room in 3 quick steps, guiding her father to the nearest chair, pressing a glass of water into his hands, murmuring low, practical instructions until his breathing steadied. Julian watched the entire scene from where he stood near the mantel, and something in his expression shifted, quiet and unreadable. "Forgive me," Sir Edmund managed, once he could speak again, his voice thin with embarrassment. "A troublesome chest. It has plagued me all winter." "There is nothing to forgive," Julian said, and Meg noticed, with some surprise, that he said it to her father directly, kindly, without the practiced charm he had used on Cordelia all afternoon. It was, she thought, the first entirely genuine thing she had heard him say since he arrived. When the visit ended and Julian rose to take his leave, Cordelia walked him to the door with a great deal of lingering conversation about the Hartleys' garden party, and Meg slipped away to the kitchen to arrange for broth to be sent up to her father's room, assuming the encounter had ended and she had, as usual, become invisible again the moment she was no longer needed to manage a crisis. She was wrong. Julian found her there 10 minutes later, having made some excuse to Cordelia about forgetting his gloves, standing in the doorway of the kitchen with an expression Meg could not quite place, somewhere between curiosity and something more careful. "You handle a crisis well, Miss Whitmore," he said. Meg looked up from the tray she was preparing, startled. "I have had a great deal of practice." "How long has your father been ill?" 2 years, perhaps longer if I am honest. He hides it well when he has the strength to. And you manage the household in the meantime." It was not quite a question, and Meg found herself hesitating, unused to anyone noticing the shape of her days at all, let alone asking about them directly. "Someone must," she said finally. "My sister has other talents." "Does she?" Something dry crept into his voice, so faint Meg almost missed it. "She is very good at being admired," Meg said, and then, immediately, felt a flush of guilt at the disloyalty of the words, however true they were. "That is unkind of me. She cannot help what people notice and what they do not." "I do not think it unkind," Julian said. "I think it honest. There is a difference, though most people in this county seem to have forgotten it." Meg studied him for a long moment, uncertain what to make of a rake known across 3 counties for saying whatever pleased a woman most, standing in her family's kitchen speaking, apparently, only the truth. "You did not come back for your gloves," she said. A slow, surprised smile crossed his face, as though she had caught him at something he had not fully admitted to himself. "No," he agreed. "I did not." "Then why did you come back, Mr. Ashworth?" He considered the question longer than she expected, long enough that the silence between them grew almost uncomfortable, almost interesting. "I am not entirely certain," he said finally. "I find that troubling." Before Meg could respond, Cordelia's voice rang out from the hallway, bright and slightly impatient, calling his name, and the moment broke apart as easily as it had formed. Julian straightened, the careless charm sliding back over his features like a mask returning to its place. "Good day, Miss Whitmore," he said, and left to find his gloves in the front hall, precisely where he had left them. Meg stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment afterward, the tray of broth forgotten in her hands, trying to understand the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had settled somewhere beneath her ribs, and trying, with rather more determination, to talk herself out of it. He was courting her sister. He had a reputation that stretched the length of the county and back again. A reputation built on exactly this kind of small attention paid to exactly this kind of overlooked woman. Attention that meant nothing and led nowhere, and would vanish the moment it grew inconvenient. She had watched him do the same thing to Cordelia not an hour before, complimenting her hands, her laugh, her taste in ribbon. She would not be foolish. She had spent her whole life learning not to want things she could not have, and she was not about to unlearn that lesson now, over a handsome man's 10 minutes of curiosity in a kitchen doorway. Over the following 2 weeks, Julian called at the Whitmore house 4 more times, always ostensibly for Cordelia, always finding some reason to linger afterward, some question for Meg about the household accounts, or her father's health, or the running of the estate, questions no other man of his standing had ever thought to ask her. Each time Meg told herself it was nothing. Each time she found herself thinking about it long after he had gone. Cordelia, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by the arrangement, too pleased with the attention of a known rake to notice how much of it drifted, quietly, toward her sister. She spoke often of the garden party at the Hartleys, of the new gown she intended to order for it, of the jealousy it would provoke in Lord Ellison, who continued to call as well, growing visibly more frustrated with each visit he found Julian's carriage already at the door. Meg watched the 2 men circle her sister like hounds after the same fox, and found herself, increasingly, watching one of them rather more closely than the other. She scolded herself for it nightly. She reminded herself, lying awake in the small room at the back of the house that had once belonged to a nursery maid, that men like Julian Ashworth did not fall in love with plain, practical women who managed household ledgers and sat up with sick fathers. Men like Julian Ashworth fell in love, briefly and dramatically, with women like Cordelia, and then moved on to the next beautiful face before the season had properly ended. She told herself this every night, and every night, some small, foolish part of her did not quite believe it. By the end of the 2nd week, the letter from the bank had been joined by 2 more, each colder than the last, and Meg sat late into the night with the household ledger spread before her, trying to find money that did not exist, trying to hold together a household that everyone else in the family seemed content to let her carry alone, while her sister planned gowns and her father slept and a man she had no right to think about kept finding excuses to linger in doorways, asking her questions no one had thought to ask her in years. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts near midnight, and she looked up to find her father's old housekeeper, Mrs. Bramwell, standing in the doorway with a shawl over her nightgown and concern written plainly across her weathered face. "You are working yourself into the ground, child," Mrs. Bramwell said, setting down a small pot of tea she had brought unasked. "Your mother would not have wanted this for you." "My mother is not here to want anything," Meg said, more sharply than she intended, and immediately softened. "Forgive me, I am tired, that is all." "You are more than tired. You are carrying this whole house on your back and no one in it seems to notice the weight." Mrs. Bramwell settled into the chair across from her, uninvited but not unwelcome. "I have watched you since you were a girl of 10, following your mother about with a little apron and a serious face, and I have never once seen anyone thank you properly for it." Meg managed a tired smile. "You thank me. I am the housekeeper. It is rather my duty to notice such things." Mrs. Bramwell's eyes softened. "But I noticed something else, these past 2 weeks. That gentleman, Mr. Ashworth, he does not look at your sister the way he looks at you." Meg's hand stilled over the ledger. "He does not look at me at all, Mrs. Bramwell. Not in any way that matters. I have run this household long enough to know when a man is performing and when he is not," the older woman said. "With Miss Cordelia, he performs beautifully. Every word polished, every compliment aimed just where it will land best. With you, he forgets to perform at all. He simply talks. I have seen it from the hallway more than once." "You should not have been listening. I was passing with the tea tray. It is not my fault my ears still work." Mrs. Bramwell rose, patting Meg's shoulder with a rough, affectionate hand. "I only say this because I do not wish to see you spend your whole life folding yourself smaller so that others might feel larger beside you. You are not a shadow, Margaret Whitmore, whatever this family has taught you to believe. Now finish your tea and go to bed. The numbers will still be wrong in the morning, but you will have more strength to face them." She left as quietly as she had come, and Meg sat alone with the tea cooling in front of her, turning the housekeeper's words over in her mind long after the candle had burned low. She wanted, badly, to believe them. She had spent so many years training herself not to want things that believing felt almost like a danger, a door left carelessly open to a disappointment she was not certain she could survive twice. She thought of her mother, who had died when Meg was 15, leaving behind a gentle, distracted husband and 2 daughters who could not have been more different if they had been raised in separate houses entirely. Her mother had loved them both equally, Meg believed, but it was Meg who had inherited her mother's quiet steadiness, her habit of noticing what needed doing before anyone asked, while Cordelia had inherited only her mother's beauty, and none of the substance beneath it. It was not Cordelia's fault, precisely. Beauty asked nothing of a person except to be seen, and Cordelia had simply never been required to develop anything more. Meg did not resent her sister for that, not truly, though there were nights, rare and private, when she allowed herself to wonder what her own life might have looked like, if the world had ever once looked at her the way it looked at Cordelia, without her having to earn it first through usefulness. She banked the fire, gathered the ledger and the unanswered letters into their drawer, and climbed the narrow stairs to her small room, Mrs. Bramwell's words following her the whole way. Somewhere below, in the greater part of the house, her father slept peacefully for the first time in days, and her sister dreamed, no doubt, of primrose gowns and garden parties, and the admiration of 2 competing suitors. Meg lay awake a long while, staring at the cracked plaster of her ceiling, thinking not of the bank's letters or her father's cough, but of a man who forgot to perform when he spoke to her, and wondering, against every hard-won instinct she possessed, whether Mrs. Bramwell might, just possibly, be right. The garden party at the Hartley estate began with sunshine and ended, for Julian Ashworth, in a discovery that changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about the season. The lawns had been dressed in white pavilions and long tables of iced cakes, and half the county seemed to have turned out to see whether the rumored rivalry between Julian Ashworth and Lord Peter Ellison would finally come to a head over the affections of the celebrated Miss Whitmore. Julian arrived intending to give them exactly the show they wanted. He found, within the first hour, that his heart was not entirely in the performance. Cordelia was radiant in primrose yellow, exactly as she had promised, surrounded within minutes by a cluster of admirers that included both Julian and Lord Ellison, each pretending not to notice the other while competing openly for her attention. She handled the rivalry with obvious delight, laughing at Ellison's dull jokes about his horses, then turning immediately to flirt with Julian about nothing at all, clearly enjoying the tension between the 2 men far more than she enjoyed either of their company specifically. Julian played along for the better part of an hour, offering compliments that had grown, he realized with some discomfort, easier to produce than to mean. He had said the same clever things to a dozen women before Cordelia. He could have recited them in his sleep, There was no danger in any of it, no risk, nothing that touched him at all beneath the surface performance. And for the first time in his career as a rake, that emptiness bothered him. He found himself scanning the crowd, not for Cordelia's admirers or Ellison's scowling face, but for a plain gray dress among the brighter colors of the party. He found her, eventually, seated on a bench at the far edge of the garden, half hidden by a rose trellis, a book open on her lap that she did not appear to actually be reading. She looked, Julian thought, like a woman who had learned to disappear so thoroughly that she had begun to believe the trick herself. He excused himself from Cordelia's circle with a murmured apology about needing air and crossed the lawn toward the trellis. Hiding, Miss Whitmore? Meg looked up, startled, then composed herself quickly, closing the book over one finger to mark her place. Resting. There is a difference, though I grant the two look remarkably similar from a distance. May I rest as well? He gestured to the empty half of the bench. It is a public garden, Mr. Ashworth. I can hardly stop you. He sat anyway, close enough to see the title of the book she had been pretending to read. A slim volume of poetry with a cracked spine, clearly well loved. You read poetry. I read a great many things, when I have the time for it, which is not often. She glanced toward the crowd, where Cordelia's laugh rose bright and clear over the general noise of the party. You are meant to be over there, I think. My sister will wonder where you have gone. Your sister has 2 admirers currently competing for her attention, and does not appear to be missing either of us particularly. Julian tilted his head, studying her profile. Does it not bother you, watching? Watching what? All of it. The attention, the admirers, the gowns bought and the letters written, and the whole machinery of a season built entirely around making one woman feel adored, while the woman managing the household that pays for it sits alone with a book she is not reading, hidden behind a rose trellis. Meg's composure slipped, just slightly, surprise and something sharper flickering across her face before she smoothed it away. That is a rather uncharitable summary of my life, Mr. Ashworth. Is it inaccurate? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its practiced lightness. No, she admitted, it is not inaccurate, but bothering myself over it changes nothing. My sister is beautiful. The world rewards beauty. I am not beautiful, and the world has never pretended otherwise, and I decided a long time ago that resenting an unchangeable fact was a poor use of my limited time. I do not think that fact is quite as unchangeable as you have decided it is. Something in his tone made her look at him directly, fully, for the first time since he had sat down, and Julian found himself caught by the steadiness of her gaze, the complete absence of any performance in it. Cordelia's eyes, when she looked at him, always seemed to be checking their effect in some invisible mirror. Meg's eyes simply looked, plainly, at what was in front of her, and asked nothing of it. You should not say such things, Meg said quietly. It is unkind, and I do not think you mean to be unkind, but it is unkind all the same, to say pretty words to a woman you are not courting, while courting her sister openly in front of the entire county. The rebuke landed harder than Julian expected, and he found, to his own surprise, that he had no clever answer ready for it. He had 100 practiced responses for a woman who resisted his charm, teasing replies designed to disarm and delight, but none of them fit the quiet, direct honesty of what Meg had just said to him, and he understood, with a discomfort he was not accustomed to feeling, that she was entirely right. You are correct, he said finally. I apologize. Meg blinked, clearly not expecting the apology any more than he had expected to offer it. You are not accustomed to apologizing, I think. Not often, no. A faint, self-aware smile crossed his face. You are proving to be a rather bad influence on my usual habits, Miss Whitmore. I have been called many things. A bad influence is a new one. But something had eased in her posture, the sharpness softening into something closer to reluctant amusement, and for a moment, sitting together on the bench at the edge of the party, neither of them said anything at all, and the silence felt, strangely, more honest than any conversation Julian had had all season. It did not last. Lord Ellison's voice carried across the lawn, loud and irritated, and both of them looked up to see him storming away from Cordelia's circle, his face red, while Cordelia herself stood laughing behind her fan at whatever had provoked him. I should go, Meg said, rising quickly. If Peter Ellison has been embarrassed in front of half the county, he will need someone to smooth things over before he says something he cannot take back, and my sister will not think to do it. Let me help. You have caused enough trouble for one afternoon, Mr. Ashworth, simply by being here, but there was no real anger in it, only a tired, familiar resignation, and she hurried away across the lawn before he could argue further. leaving him alone on the bench with her book of poetry, which she had forgotten in her haste. He turned it over in his hands. The pages were soft with use, certain lines marked lightly in pencil, the private annotations of a woman who read carefully and thought deeply about what she read, in complete privacy, because no one had ever cared enough to ask her opinion on any of it. He found himself wanting, quite badly, to ask. He did not return the book that day. He kept it, instead, tucked inside his coat and told himself he would return it properly at the next opportunity, though some quieter, more honest part of him suspected he simply wanted an excuse to speak with her again. The rest of the garden party unfolded exactly as such parties always did, though Julian found his attention drifting throughout, watching Meg move quietly among the guests, managing her father's comfort in the shade, calming Lord Ellison's wounded pride with a few careful words, refilling her sister's lemonade without ever once being thanked for it. She was, he realized with growing clarity, the person actually holding the Whitmore family together, while everyone around her, including himself until very recently, had looked straight past her toward the brighter, easier target of her sister. That evening, riding home with Henry Colton, Julian found himself unusually quiet, and Henry, never a subtle man, noticed immediately. "You have barely said a word since we left Faircross," Henry observed. "Did Ellison finally work up the nerve to call you out over Miss Whitmore?" "No." "Then what has put you in such a state?" Julian considered the question for a long moment, the book of poetry a small, solid weight against his ribs, where he had tucked it inside his coat. "I believe," he said slowly, "that I have spent the entire season chasing the wrong sister." Henry laughed, assuming a joke, and Julian did not correct him, mostly because he was not yet certain himself how serious the words truly were. But they sat with him the rest of the ride home, growing heavier rather than lighter, and by the time he reached his own house and retired to his study, he found he could not stop thinking about a plain gray dress, a cracked book of poetry, and a woman who had told him, plainly and without flattery, exactly what she thought of him, and had been entirely right to do so. He opened the book that night, reading the pencil marks in the margins by candlelight, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely curious about another person's mind, rather than merely their face. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore house, Meg discovered the missing book only after she had already undressed for bed, and lay awake a long while wondering whether Julian Ashworth had taken it by accident or by design, and disliking, quite intensely, how much she hoped it was the latter. She told herself, as she had told herself every night for 2 weeks, that nothing had changed, that he was still courting her sister, that his attention toward her meant nothing beyond a passing curiosity that would fade the moment something brighter caught his eye. She told herself this firmly and repeatedly, and found, for the first time, that she no longer entirely believed it. Something had shifted that afternoon on the bench by the rose trellis, something small and dangerous and impossible to take back, and though neither of them said it aloud, both Julian Ashworth and Margaret Whitmore fell asleep that night thinking of each other, rather than the sister who stood, technically, between them. But that was still 2 days away, and for the remainder of the garden party, the county had other entertainment to occupy it. Lord Ellison, still smarting from whatever remark had sent him storming off the lawn, found Cordelia again near the refreshment tables an hour later, and this time his complaint was louder, carried easily on the summer air to anyone standing nearby. "You cannot continue playing us against one another forever, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice tight with wounded pride. "A man begins to wonder whether he is being courted at all, or merely used as a prop in some game meant to entertain you." "How dramatic you are, Peter." Cordelia's fan snapped open with practiced grace, though a flush of genuine annoyance colored her cheeks. "I have made no promises to you. I have made no promises to anyone. I fail to see why my simply enjoying a party should provoke such a scene." "Because everyone here can see it for what it is," Ellison said, "and I find I am tired of being made a fool of in front of the entire county." The exchange drew glances from every direction, exactly the kind of public spectacle Cordelia usually relished, though this time her expression suggested she had not entirely intended the scene to unfold quite so publicly. It was Meg, arriving at the refreshment table on some errand for her father, who stepped smoothly between them before matters could worsen further. "Lord Ellison," she said, her voice pitched low and calm, the same voice she used to steady her father through his worst coughing fits. "Might I trouble you to help me find a chair in the shade for my father? He has been asking after you specifically. He so admires your knowledge of horses." It was, Julian would learn later, an entirely fabricated errand, but it worked precisely as Meg intended. Flattered despite himself, and grateful for an excuse to leave the humiliating scene with some dignity intact. Ellison offered his arm and allowed himself to be led away toward the shade, his anger visibly cooling with every step. Cordelia watched them go with an expression of mild relief, fanning herself briskly. "Thank goodness for Meg," she murmured to no one in particular, already turning back toward her circle of admirers as though the crisis had never happened at all. Julian, standing near enough to have heard the entire exchange, found himself struck once again by the quiet, practiced skill with which Meg managed every difficulty in her family's orbit, always without credit, always without complaint, as though smoothing over other people's messes were simply the price of existing in a household that had never once thought to smooth anything over for her in return. He spent the remainder of the party watching her work, and found the sight far more compelling than anything Cordelia's beauty had to offer. By the time the guests began departing in the late afternoon, the sky had turned the soft gold of early evening, and Julian lingered near his carriage, rather than departing immediately, watching the Whitmore family prepare to leave. Sir Edmund, tired from the day's heat, leaned heavily on Meg's arm as they made their way toward their own carriage, while Cordelia walked ahead, already deep in conversation with another young lady about the excitement of the afternoon's drama. "Your father looks unwell," Julian said, approaching before he had entirely decided to. "He tires easily," Meg said. "The heat does not help. I should have insisted we leave an hour ago, but he so rarely gets to attend anything anymore, and I did not wish to be the one who took that from him." "You take a great deal of care of everyone but yourself, Miss Whitmore. Someone must take care of them, Mr. Ashworth. It might as well be me. I am the only one in this family who never seems to require much taking care of in return." She said it lightly, but Julian heard, beneath the lightness, something worn thin from years of repetition, a truth she had accepted so long ago that she had stopped noticing how heavy it still was to carry. "That is not a virtue," he said quietly. "That is simply a burden no one has thought to share." Meg looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment the careful distance she kept between herself and the rest of the world seemed to waver, just slightly, just enough for him to see something rawer underneath the composure, something that looked almost like hope, quickly and deliberately suppressed. "You should return my book," she said instead, changing the subject with the practiced skill of a woman who had spent years redirecting conversations away from anything too dangerous to examine closely. "I noticed it missing this afternoon. I intend to, properly. Perhaps I might call on Thursday, on the pretense of returning it, and we might discuss the poems you have marked. That would give my sister the wrong impression entirely." "Would it?" Julian's voice was quiet, careful, stripped of its usual practiced charm. "I am beginning to wonder whether it is my sister I ought to be calling upon at all." The words hung in the warm evening air between them, more honest than either of them had intended, and Meg's breath caught visibly before she recovered herself, glancing quickly toward her father, toward the carriage, toward anywhere that was not the steady, unsettling honesty in Julian Ashworth's eyes. "You should not say such things to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is not fair, not to me, and not to my sister, who has done nothing wrong except be born with a face the world decided to love." "You are right," Julian admitted. "It is not fair. I am not certain, at this moment, precisely what the fair thing to do would be." "Then perhaps you ought to decide, before you say anything more that neither of us can take back." She left him standing beside his carriage, hurrying to catch up with her father, and Julian watched her go with the strange, uncomfortable sensation of a man who had built his entire reputation on knowing exactly what he wanted and how to get it, suddenly finding himself with no plan at all, only a growing certainty that everything he had believed about this season, about Cordelia, about himself, had been built on a foundation that no longer felt solid beneath his feet. He rode home slowly that evening, the borrowed book of poetry still tucked against his ribs, and did not notice, until he had nearly reached his own front door, that he had been smiling, faintly and helplessly, the entire way. 2 days later, a letter from the bank arrived that made every other concern in the Whitmore household seem suddenly, urgently small, and Meg would have little time in the days that followed for poetry, or roses, or the quiet, dangerous hope that had begun to grow somewhere beneath her careful composure. The letter that arrived 2 mornings after the garden party was not like the others. Meg read it standing in the study, the early light thin and gray through the window, and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet as the words settled into meaning. The bank had run out of patience. Without full payment within 3 weeks, they would begin proceedings to seize the eastern farm, and if the debt was not settled entirely within the following month, the house itself, the Whitmore family home for 4 generations, would follow. She sat down heavily in her father's chair, the letter trembling slightly in her hands, and allowed herself 30 seconds of pure, unguarded fear before she straightened her spine, folded the letter, and began, once again, the exhausting work of trying to solve a problem that had no easy solution. She could not tell her father. His heart, already weakened by 2 years of illness, would not survive the shock of losing the home he had inherited from his own father. She could not fully explain it to Cordelia either, not because her sister lacked the capacity to understand, but because Cordelia had never once, in 23 years, been asked to carry weight of any kind, and Meg did not know how to hand her a burden that heavy without watching her crumble beneath it. So she did what she had always done. She carried it alone. She spent that day and the next writing to every relation she could think of, however distant, however unlikely to help, searching for any avenue that might buy the family more time. She visited the bank in person, a humiliating and largely fruitless errand that left her standing outside the building afterward, blinking back tears in the street, before composing herself and walking home as though nothing at all had happened. It was on the third day, exhausted and increasingly desperate, that Cordelia finally noticed something was wrong. "You have barely eaten in 2 days," Cordelia said, finding Meg in the study late one evening, ledgers spread across the desk, candle burned low. "And you have been avoiding me. What is it, Meg? What has happened?" For a moment Meg considered lying, as she had lied so many times before, offering some small, manageable excuse that would let her sister return to her gowns and garden parties without the burden of the truth. But exhaustion had worn down her usual careful walls, and the words spilled out before she could stop them. The bank, the debt, the farm, the house itself, all of it. Everything she had been carrying silently for 2 years, and more urgently for the past 3 days. Cordelia's face went pale as she listened, her hand pressed to her mouth, and when Meg finished, a long silence stretched between them, broken only by the sputtering candle. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" Cordelia's voice cracked, something in it Meg had rarely heard before, genuine distress rather than performed dismay. "All this time, and I have been thinking of nothing but gowns and dances, while you carried this alone. I did not want to frighten you." "You should have frightened me." Cordelia crossed the room and knelt beside the desk, taking Meg's hands in her own, and for the first time in longer than Meg could remember, her sister's attention felt entirely genuine, entirely present, stripped of the usual performance. "I have been so foolish, Meg, so endlessly foolish. I thought Mr. Ashworth's attention, and Lord Ellison's, was a game I was winning. I never once considered that a marriage to either of them might be the only thing standing between this family and ruin. Cordelia, I did not tell you this so that you would sell yourself to the highest bidder. Did you not?" Cordelia's smile was sad, knowing, older than Meg had ever seen it. What else is a season for, in a family as poor as ours? I have always known it, I think, somewhere beneath the gowns and the dancing. I simply preferred not to look at it too closely. The conversation that followed was longer and more honest than any the sisters had shared in years, and by its end, something had shifted quietly between them, an old distance beginning, very slightly, to close. Cordelia insisted on helping, on writing letters, on accompanying Meg to visit distant relations, and though her efforts were often more enthusiastic than useful, the simple fact of her presence, of finally sharing a burden that had been carried alone for so long, eased something in Meg that she had not realized was so tightly wound. But sharing the weight did not make the weight lighter. 3 weeks was not long enough to save a farm, let alone a house, and by the second week, Meg's careful efforts had produced nothing but polite refusals, and a growing, cold certainty that they would lose everything. It was Mrs. Bramwell, ever practical, who finally suggested the one solution neither sister wanted to consider aloud. "There is still Lord Ellison," the housekeeper said carefully, one evening as she helped Meg sort through yet another stack of unanswered correspondence. "He has made his interest plain enough. A man with his fortune could settle this debt without noticing the cost. If Miss Cordelia accepted him, and quickly, the marriage settlement alone might save this house." Cordelia, present for the suggestion, went very still. "I do not love him. Love is a luxury for families who are not 3 weeks from losing their home," Mrs. Bramwell said, not unkindly, but firmly. "I am sorry to say it so plainly, but someone must." That night, Cordelia came to Meg's small room long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed with an expression Meg had never seen on her sister's face before, something raw and frightened beneath the beauty that usually shielded her from ever appearing anything less than perfectly composed. "I think I must accept him," Cordelia said quietly. "Lord Ellison, if he offers again, I think I must say yes." "Cordelia." Do not tell me otherwise, Meg. I have thought of nothing else for 2 days. He is not unkind. He would provide for Papa, and for you, and this house would remain ours. She twisted her hands together in her lap, and for a moment looked younger than her 23 years, uncertain in a way she had never allowed herself to be in public. I only wish. She stopped herself, but Meg understood the unfinished thought well enough. Somewhere, quietly, beneath the practical calculation of the decision, Cordelia was grieving something else entirely. A version of the season she had imagined for herself, bright and admired and, perhaps briefly, genuinely fond of a certain charming rake who had spent the last month calling at their door. You wish it were someone else, Meg said softly. Cordelia looked up, and something passed between the sisters that had never quite existed before, a rare, unguarded honesty. I liked him, you know, Mr. Ashworth. I liked the attention, certainly, but I think, somewhere beneath the vanity of it, I liked him too. He is cleverer than most of the men who call here, wittier. I thought, for a foolish week or two, that something real might come of it. Meg's chest tightened with a guilt she had no right to feel, and yet felt entirely, completely, all the same. She said nothing, uncertain her voice would remain steady if she tried. But it does not matter now, Cordelia continued, wiping quickly at her eyes before any tear could properly fall, composing herself with the same practiced speed she used before every ball. None of it matters, beside the house, beside Papa's health, beside all of it. I will accept Lord Ellison, and I will learn to be content, and that is simply how these things must go for women like us. She left shortly after, and Meg lay awake long into the night, torn between relief that her family might be saved, and a grief she could not fully name, something tangled and complicated, that had nothing to do with the house or the bank at all, and everything to do with a man who had called 4 times in a fortnight for her sister, and lingered, every time, in doorways meant for her. She thought of the borrowed book of poetry, still unreturned. She thought of a rose trellis, and an honest, unguarded question about whether he ought to be calling on a different sister entirely. She thought of Mrs. Bramwell's words, that he forgot to perform when he spoke to her, and wondered, with a bitterness she was ashamed of, whether any of it had ever been real at all, or whether she had simply mistaken a rake's idle curiosity for something it had never truly been. Whatever it had been, it did not matter now. Cordelia would marry Lord Ellison, the house would be saved, and Meg would return, as she always had, to the quiet, unremarkable work of holding a family together from the shadows, expecting nothing, and therefore, she told herself firmly, risking nothing at all. Julian had spent the 2 weeks since the garden party in a state of restless confusion, entirely foreign to his usual nature. He had called at the Whitmore house twice more, ostensibly for Cordelia, and both times found himself watching the doorways for a plain gray dress, rather than listening to whatever charming nonsense his mouth produced automatically for the sister he was meant to be courting. He had not yet returned the book of poetry. He told himself, each time he noticed it sitting on his desk, that he would bring it on his next visit, and each time, some cowardly instinct he did not entirely understand, kept it tucked in a drawer instead. Returning it meant seeing her again, and seeing her again meant confronting a question he had spent 2 weeks carefully avoiding, namely, what exactly he intended to do about a growing feeling that had no proper place in the season he had planned. That evening, arriving home from his club later than usual, he found Henry Colton waiting in his study, with an expression far too serious for the hour. I have heard something you ought to know, Henry said, without preamble, concerning the Whitmore family. Julian's stomach tightened, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation. Go on. It is common knowledge at the club tonight, though I doubt it has spread further yet. Sir Edmund Whitmore is deeply in debt. The Eastern farm has failed. The bank is threatening to seize it within the month. And if matters are not resolved, the house itself may follow. Ellison's man let something slip over cards, boasting that his master intended to make an offer for Miss Whitmore before the debt became common knowledge, so that no one could later say he had married her out of pity rather than genuine feeling. Julian sat down slowly, the pieces of the past month rearranging themselves rapidly in his mind. Meg's exhaustion, the letters he had glimpsed once on the study desk during a visit, quickly hidden when she noticed him looking, her father's illness, her constant, quiet vigilance over every detail of the household, the particular tightness around her eyes these past weeks that he had noticed without understanding. She has been carrying this alone, he said quietly, more to himself than to Henry. Who has? Meg. The name came out before he could stop it, and Henry's eyebrows rose sharply at the familiarity of it, but Julian did not care to explain himself just then. His mind was already elsewhere, already turning over the shape of a problem he found, quite suddenly, that he very much wanted to solve. "You cannot possibly mean to involve yourself in the Whitmore family's finances," Henry said slowly, watching his friend's face. "Julian, what exactly is happening here?" "I do not entirely know," Julian admitted, "but I intend to find out, and quickly, before Peter Ellison buys himself a wife out of a family's desperation and calls it courtship." He spent the remainder of that night awake, pacing his study, turning over what little he possessed that might actually help, his own fortune, considerable though not limitless, connections at the bank that might be persuaded to extend patience where a stranger's pleading letters had failed, and beneath all of it, a growing uncomfortable clarity about where his own feelings actually lay, and how thoroughly he had misjudged them from the very first night at Faircross Hall. He had come to the ball intending to chase a beautiful woman for sport, to win a small, satisfying victory over a rival he found tiresome, and to pass another empty season exactly as he had passed the last 4. Instead, he had found himself, against every plan and every habit of 4 careless years, thinking constantly of a plain, tired, endlessly capable woman who had told him honestly, more than once, precisely what she thought of him, and had never once tried to make herself more appealing in his eyes by pretending otherwise. He understood, finally, sitting alone in his study as the candle burned down toward morning, that Henry's earlier assumption had been entirely correct, if aimed at the wrong sister. He had lost a wager after all, though not the one anyone at Faircross Hall had expected him to lose. He had lost his heart, quietly and completely, somewhere between a rose trellis and a kitchen doorway, to a woman the rest of the county had spent her whole life failing to see. The only question now was whether he had realized it in time, or whether Peter Ellison's fortune and a family's desperation would settle the matter before Julian ever had the chance to say so aloud. He resolved, before the candle finally guttered out entirely, that he would not simply stand by and watch it happen. Whatever it cost him, whatever reputation he had to shed, whatever careful distance he had always kept from anything resembling genuine feeling, he intended to act, and quickly, before the season decided the rest of his life for him without his consent. Lord Ellison called on the Whitmore house 3 days later, dressed with unusual formality, and Meg knew, the moment she saw his carriage in the drive, exactly what he had come to do. She busied herself in the study while Cordelia received him alone in the drawing room, unable to bear watching her sister prepare to sacrifice herself for a house and a debt that was not, in any fair accounting, Cordelia's burden to carry at all. Meg had spent 2 years shielding her sister from precisely this kind of weight, and now, at the final moment, she had failed, and the failure would cost Cordelia a marriage built on necessity rather than affection. The proposal, when it came, was brief and businesslike, more a transaction than a declaration, and Cordelia, according to what she reported afterward with a composure that did not quite reach her eyes, had accepted it in much the same spirit. "It is done," Cordelia said, finding Meg in the study an hour later, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face carefully blank in the way it had been ever since the night she first learned the truth about the family's finances. "He wishes to marry quickly, before the debt becomes public knowledge, so that no one may say the marriage was made from pity. The settlement will clear everything, Meg. The farm, the bank, all of it. Papa will keep the house. Cordelia, do not, please." Cordelia's voice wavered, just slightly, the only crack in an otherwise steady performance. "If you say one kind word to me just now, I believe I shall cry, and I have promised myself I would not cry over this. It is a good match. He is not unkind. Many women marry for far worse reasons than saving their family's home." Meg crossed the room and embraced her sister, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of the decision settling silently between them, equal parts relief and grief, saved and sacrificed at once. Word of the engagement spread through the county within a day, and it was inevitable, given the small and gossiping nature of their society, that Julian would hear of it before he could act on any of the plans he had spent a sleepless night constructing. He arrived at the Whitmore house the following afternoon, having spent the intervening hours making inquiries at the bank, quietly and without revealing his purpose, only to discover that a settlement had already been offered elsewhere, and that the matter was, for all practical purposes, already resolved. He found Meg alone in the garden behind the house, sitting on a low stone bench near a small overgrown hedge, staring at nothing in particular with an expression of exhausted resignation that struck him harder than he expected. "I heard, Rez, sitting beside her without waiting for an invitation, about your sister and Ellison. News travels quickly, when it concerns something the whole county has been waiting to see resolved for weeks." Meg did not look at him. You should congratulate her properly when you see her. She has done a brave thing, in her own way, and I do not think anyone will thank her properly for it. I do not wish to congratulate her. I wish to ask why no one told me the true state of your family's finances before matters reached this point. Meg finally turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her tired features. Why would that concern you, Mr. Ashworth? You are not family. You are not even, properly speaking, courting my sister any longer, now that she is engaged to another man. I intended to help. I have connections at the bank. I have my own fortune, considerable enough to have cleared the debt without any of you needing to sacrifice a marriage for it, if only I had known in time. Something in Meg's expression shifted, hope and disbelief and a fresh, sharp grief tangled together. Why would you have done such a thing? Julian took a slow breath, aware that the moment he had been circling for weeks had finally, unavoidably, arrived. Because I have spent this entire season pursuing your sister for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine feeling, and somewhere along the way, without ever intending it, I fell in love with you instead, quietly, and then not quietly at all. I have thought of little else for a fortnight, Meg. I kept your book of poetry rather than returning it because I did not want to give myself a reason to stay away from this house, and I have been the greatest fool in 3 counties for not saying so before your sister accepted another man out of necessity, when I might have solved the necessity myself, had I only understood the danger in time. The silence that followed stretched long and taut, and Meg stared at him as though he had spoken in a language she only half understood, wanting desperately to believe every word and trusting none of it at all. You cannot mean that, she said finally, her voice unsteady. I mean every word of it. You spent a month courting my sister in front of the entire county. You danced with her, complimented her, called on her 4 times in a fortnight with flowers and pretty words, and now, the very week she becomes engaged to another man out of desperate necessity, you appear in my garden to declare feelings for me that you never once mentioned while there was still time for it to matter? Meg rose from the bench, something fierce and wounded breaking through her usual careful composure. Forgive me, Mr. Ashworth, if I find the timing of your declaration rather too convenient to trust. Meg. No. She turned to face him fully, tears standing bright in her eyes though her voice remained steady, fierce with years of accumulated hurt finally finding a place to land. I have spent my whole life watching men look past me toward whatever brighter, easier prize stood beside me. I learned long ago not to hope for anything different, because hoping only made the disappointment sharper when it inevitably came. And now you sit here, in my family's garden, on the very day my sister has sacrificed her own happiness to save this house, and tell me that you have secretly loved me all along, as though that makes any of it easier to bear. I did not know about the debt in time to help. I did not know how deeply I felt until... That is precisely my point. Her voice cracked, finally, the composure she had held so carefully for weeks finally giving way. You did not know. You spent a month in this house, watching me manage everything, watching my father's illness and my sister's engagement unfold in front of you, and you only understood your own feelings once it was too late to act on them usefully. What good is love that arrives only after the moment it might have mattered has already passed? Julian had no answer for that, and the absence of one seemed to confirm, in Meg's eyes, everything she had already decided to believe. I will not be your consolation, Mr. Ashworth, she said quietly, wiping at her eyes with the back of one hand, angry at herself for the tears even as she could not stop them. I will not be the plain sister you settle for once the beautiful one is no longer available to chase. I have spent 23 years being someone's second thought, and I find I have finally run out of patience for it, however prettily the sentiment is dressed up. That is not what this is. Is it not? She laughed, sharp and humorless. You cannot even tell me, honestly, that you would have looked at me twice if my sister had not been in the room first. You noticed me because I was standing beside her, because I managed the household she never had to think about, because I was quiet and useful and available in a way she was not, once Lord Ellison made his offer first. That is not love, Mr. Ashworth. That is convenience. Discovered a fortnight too late to be anything more honorable than that. You are wrong, Julian said, his own voice rising now, frustration and desperation tangling together. I know precisely what I feel, and it has nothing to do with convenience. I would have come to you eventually, debt or no debt, engagement or no engagement, because what I feel for you is not a reaction to your sister's unavailability. It has grown, slowly and completely, out of 100 small moments you probably do not even remember. A shawl given to your father instead of kept for your own comfort. A kitchen doorway where you spoke more honestly to me in 5 minutes than any woman has managed in 5 years. A bench by a rose trellis where you told me exactly what you thought of my behavior, and were entirely right to say it. Pretty words come easily to you, Mr. Ashworth. I have watched you produce them for my sister all season. The comparison struck him like a physical blow, and Julian understood, with a sinking clarity, that nothing he said in this moment would be believed. Not while the wound of her sister's necessary engagement was still so fresh, not while every instinct Meg possessed had been trained, over 23 years of quiet invisibility, to expect exactly this kind of disappointment and nothing better. I will not argue with you further today, he said finally, rising from the bench. You are grieving and exhausted, and you have every right to distrust anything I say to you just now. But I will not stop believing what I know to be true, and I will not stop trying to prove it, however long it takes you to trust it. Do not, Meg said, her voice breaking entirely now. Please, do not make promises you have no intention of keeping once the season ends, and something brighter catches your attention again. I would rather you leave now, cleanly, than watch you slowly forget this conversation over the following weeks, the way I have watched every promise in my life, eventually forgotten by someone who found it inconvenient to keep. She turned and walked back toward the house without waiting for his response, leaving Julian alone in the overgrown garden, the weight of her words settling over him like a physical thing, heavier than anything he had carried in 4 careless years of easy conquests and easier departures. He did not follow her. He understood, standing there in the fading afternoon light, that following her now would only confirm every fear she had just voiced. Another man pursuing her the moment pursuit became inconvenient rather than easy. Another performance dressed up as sincerity. If he wanted her to believe him, words would not be enough, not after everything her life had taught her to expect from men who found her convenient rather than chosen. He rode home slowly, turning over what little he still possessed that might prove, beyond any doubt, the truth of what he felt. An idea began to form, slow and difficult and entirely unlike anything he had ever attempted in his life. A plan that would require abandoning every careless habit he had built his reputation on, and replacing it with something far harder to fake, and far more dangerous to his pride if it failed. The days that followed brought little relief to the Whitmore household, though on the surface, matters seemed finally to be settling. Lord Ellison called each afternoon, formal and attentive in his stiff, businesslike way, and Cordelia received him with a composure that gradually, over the course of a week, began to feel less like performance, and more like something almost approaching genuine ease. He was not a passionate man, nor a particularly interesting one, but he was steady and kind in his own reserved fashion, and Cordelia, to her own quiet surprise, found herself growing accustomed to the comfort of being chosen for reasons that did not depend entirely on beauty. Meg watched the courtship unfold with a complicated tangle of relief and grief she did not fully understand herself. The house was saved. Her father's health, though still fragile, no longer bore the added weight of a debt he did not know existed. She should have felt nothing but gratitude, and yet some stubborn, wounded part of her kept returning, against every effort to stop it, to a conversation in the garden that she had ended too sharply, too quickly, before she had allowed herself to hear the whole of what Julian Ashworth had tried to say. She told herself she had been right to send him away. She told herself, repeatedly, that a man's feelings discovered only after they became convenient were not feelings worth trusting, that she had simply protected herself from a disappointment she had felt coming from the very first night at Faircross Hall, when he had caught her elbow and called her careful. She told herself all of this, and found, each time, that the telling grew less convincing rather than more. Mrs. Bramwell, ever perceptive, noticed the change in her within days. "You have been quiet since the garden," the housekeeper observed one evening, setting down a fresh pot of tea in the study where Meg sat, once again, over ledgers that no longer held any real urgency now that the debt was settled. "Quieter than even your usual quiet. I have a great deal on my mind." "You have less on your mind than you did a fortnight ago, by any honest accounting. The debt is settled. Your sister is engaged to a steady, if dull, gentleman who will treat her well enough. Your father sleeps easier, knowing nothing of how close we came to losing everything." Mrs. Bramwell settled into the chair across from her with the unhurried patience of a woman who had raised 3 children of her own and buried a husband, and had long ago stopped being intimidated by silence. "So tell me, child, what precisely is troubling you now, if not the house?" Meg set down her pen, unable to maintain the pretense any longer under the older woman's steady gaze. "He came to me, Mr. Ashworth, the day after Cordelia's engagement was announced. He told me he loved me, that he had loved me for weeks, and I sent him away without truly listening to a word of it." "And why did you send him away, if I may ask?" "Because it was too convenient, Mrs. Bramwell. He spent a month courting my sister in front of the entire county, and only discovered his feelings for me once she had already accepted another man. What am I meant to make of that, except that I was his second choice, offered only once his first was no longer available? Mrs. Bramwell was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over with the same careful attention she gave to every problem in the household, however small. I have watched that young man in this house more than a dozen times these past weeks, she said finally, and I will tell you plainly what I told you before, when you did not wish to hear it. He did not perform for you the way he performed for your sister, not once. I watched him bring his gloves back to the kitchen for no reason at all, watched him linger in doorways long after your sister had left the room, watched him ask after your father's health with a genuine concern I have rarely seen from any gentleman calling at this house, including, I am sorry to say, some who called upon your own mother, years ago. That does not mean he loves me. It could simply mean he is kind, or curious, or bored. Perhaps. Mrs. Bramwell's expression softened. But I have also lived long enough to know the difference between a man discovering feelings too late through simple carelessness, and a man discovering feelings too late because he never once thought to question why the sensible, quiet daughter, managing an entire household from the shadows, might be worth more of his attention than the beautiful one collecting compliments in the drawing room. The first is a fault of timing. The second is a fault of a world that has trained every one of us, including you, to believe beauty deserves notice and quiet competence does not. I do not think Mr. Ashworth is guilty of the second fault, child. I think he is simply guilty of being slow to see clearly what was in front of him the entire time, which is a very human failing, and not, I think, an unforgivable one. Meg said nothing for a long while, the housekeeper's words settling slowly into places she had kept carefully guarded for years, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than she intended. What if I am wrong to trust it? What if I let myself hope, and it proves in the end to be exactly what I feared? A convenience discovered only because nothing better remained. Then you will have been disappointed, as you have been disappointed before, and you will survive it, as you have always survived it. Mrs. Bramwell reached across the desk and took Meg's hand, an unusual gesture of familiarity between them, offered now with evident care. But if you refuse even to consider the possibility that he means exactly what he said, out of fear that you might be wrong, you will spend the rest of your life certain of nothing except your own carefully guarded loneliness. That is a poor trade in my experience for the small risk of trusting a man who has, by every account I have witnessed with my own eyes, given you no real reason yet to doubt him beyond the timing of his own slow understanding. Meg thought of those words long after Mrs. Bramwell had returned to her duties, turning them over alongside every moment of the past month. The shawl offered to her father, the kitchen doorway, the bench by the rose trellis, the unreturned book of poetry that Julian had kept, he claimed, simply to give himself a reason to return. She did not know, yet, whether she had been too hasty in sending him away. She only knew that the certainty she had felt in the garden, sharp and protective and entirely justified in the moment, had begun, slowly and against her will, to soften into something closer to doubt, and doubt, she was beginning to understand, could be its own kind of dangerous hope. Julian did not call at the Whitmore house again for nearly 2 weeks, and the absence, though deliberate on his part, felt to Meg like a slow and quiet confirmation of everything she had accused him of in the garden. He was not idle during that time, though she had no way of knowing it. He spent his days in ways entirely unfamiliar to the man the county had known for 4 careless years, visiting the eastern farm himself to assess what repairs might restore it properly, consulting quietly with an agricultural man about better methods of drainage that might prevent the flooding that had ruined the last 2 harvests, and meeting with his own solicitor to arrange, discreetly and without any expectation of thanks, a private line of credit that could be offered to Sir Edmund Whitmore under terms far gentler than any bank would provide, should the family need it again in future. He did none of it to win Meg back through grand gestures announced publicly for effect. He did it quietly, almost secretly, because he had understood, finally, sitting alone in his study after her rejection, that words had failed him, precisely because words came too easily to a man of his reputation, and that only sustained, unglamorous, patient action could ever hope to prove what he felt was real. He also stopped attending balls entirely, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the county, which had grown accustomed to seeing Julian Ashworth at the center of every social gathering, charming and restless and endlessly available for gossip. Henry Colton, increasingly baffled by his friend's sudden transformation into a quiet, serious man who preferred solitary work on a struggling farm to an evening of cards and easy company, finally confronted him about it directly. "You have become a very dull man these past 2 weeks," Henry said, finding Julian in his study one evening, surrounded by farm ledgers rather than the usual scattered invitations to parties. "The whole county wonders what has become of you." "I am attempting to become a different sort of man than the one the county has grown used to," Julian said, not looking up from his work. "I find I am rather tired of the old one." "This is about Miss Whitmore, the younger one." "It is." Henry sat down slowly, studying his friend with genuine curiosity now rather than teasing. "You have never once, in the 4 years I have known you, worked this hard for anything, let alone a woman who has already refused you." "She has not refused me, precisely. She has told me, quite reasonably, that she does not believe me." Julian finally set down his pen, rubbing a tired hand across his face. "I intend to give her reason to believe me, whether or not it ever changes her answer. I owe her that much, at the very least, after 4 years of treating exactly this kind of quiet, genuine feeling as something to be avoided rather than pursued." Henry, for the first time in their long friendship, did not have a clever reply ready, and simply nodded, understanding, finally, that something fundamental had shifted in his oldest friend that no amount of teasing would undo. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore house, life continued in its new, uneasy calm. Cordelia's wedding to Lord Ellison was set for the autumn, and preparations occupied most of the household's attention, though Meg noticed, with a mixture of relief and quiet sorrow, that her sister approached the planning with far less enthusiasm than she once brought to a simple garden party. Cordelia was not unhappy, precisely. She was simply resigned, in the careful, practical way of a woman who had chosen security over passion, and who had decided, with admirable determination, to make peace with that choice, rather than mourn it. "Do you think one can grow to love a person?" Cordelia asked one evening, sitting with Meg in the drawing room while their father dozed by the fire, even if the beginning was made from necessity rather than feeling. "I believe it happens more often than poets would have us think," Meg said carefully. "I hope so." Cordelia's smile was small, honest, entirely without its usual performance. "He is kind to me, in his own stiff way. He asked, yesterday, whether I preferred yellow roses or white for the wedding, and seemed genuinely interested in my answer, though I do not think he has ever once cared about flowers in his life before meeting me. Perhaps that is enough, to begin with. Perhaps love simply needs somewhere small and ordinary to start." Meg thought, privately, of a kitchen doorway and a bench by a rose trellis, of a man who had once told her that Cordelia was very good at being admired, and wondered whether her sister, too, was beginning to understand what it meant to be valued for something quieter and more lasting than beauty alone. It was nearly 3 weeks after the garden confrontation when Julian finally returned to the Whitmore house, though not, this time, with flowers or compliments or any of the usual instruments of a Rake's courtship. He arrived instead with a folder of papers requesting a private audience with Sir Edmund, and Meg, informed of his arrival by a startled housemaid, felt her heart lurch painfully at the sound of his name. She did not attend the meeting herself, though she hovered near enough in the hallway to catch fragments of the conversation, her father's voice rising in surprised protest, then gradually softening into something like reluctant gratitude, and Julian's voice beneath it, steady and low, explaining terms and figures she could not fully make out. When the meeting ended, her father called her into the study, his face flushed with an emotion she could not immediately identify. "Meg," he said, gesturing her forward, "Mr. Ashworth has made an extraordinary offer. He proposes to arrange proper drainage for the eastern farm, at his own expense and direction, and to extend a private line of credit against future harvests, at terms far more generous than any bank would offer, should we ever require it again. He asks nothing in return beyond the improvement of the land itself, and the security of this family's future." Meg turned to look at Julian, who stood near the window, his expression carefully neutral, watching her with a caution she had never seen from him before. "Why would you do such a thing?" she asked quietly. "Because your family should never again be forced into a decision made from desperation rather than genuine choice," Julian said. "Whatever your sister feels for Lord Ellison, I hope it grows into something real, in time. But no family should have to gamble a daughter's future on a bank's patience, and I have the means to ensure yours never faces that particular danger again, regardless of anything else that may or may not happen between us." Sir Edmund, sensing the weight beneath the words, excused himself with unusual tact, leaving father and prospective suitor alone in a study that suddenly felt very small around them. "I did not do this to buy your forgiveness," Julian said quietly, once they were alone. "I want to be clear about that. I would have done it regardless of whether you ever spoke to me again, but I wanted you to see it, to understand that what I feel for you is not measured in pretty words alone, which I know, now, mean very little coming from a man with my reputation. It is measured in what I am willing to do, quietly, without any expectation of thanks or reward, simply because your well-being matters to me more than my own comfort or pride. Meg's eyes filled unexpectedly, with tears she had not given herself permission to shed in weeks. You stayed away for 3 weeks. I did. I did not think it fair to press my case while you were still grieving your sister's engagement, and I did not want you to mistake persistence for pressure. I wanted to give you room to decide, honestly, without my presence complicating the answer. Mrs. Bramwell told me I was wrong to send you away. A small, genuine smile crossed his face. Mrs. Bramwell sounds like an exceptionally wise woman. She generally is. Meg wiped at her eyes, laughing despite herself, a sound rusty with disuse after weeks of careful composure. I have thought of little else these 3 weeks, Mr. Ashworth. I told myself I had been right to doubt you. I told myself every night that your feelings had arrived too conveniently to trust. And every night, I found myself remembering 100 small things that did not fit that explanation at all. A shawl given to my father, a book of poetry you kept rather than returned, a man who forgot to perform the moment he began speaking to me honestly. Then perhaps, Julian said carefully, crossing the room slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, you might allow me the chance to prove the rest of it, not in a single afternoon, but over however long it takes for you to trust it fully. I do not ask you to decide anything today. I ask only for the chance to keep showing you, patiently, what I have already shown your father this morning, that I am not the man the county believes me to be, not anymore, and that whatever I feel for you has nothing to do with convenience, and everything to do with a month of watching you hold an entire family together, with nothing but quiet strength and no expectation of ever being thanked for it. Meg looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the practiced charm she had learned, over a month of careful observation, to distinguish from genuine feeling, and found, this time, only steady, patient honesty, entirely without performance. I do not forgive easily, she said finally. I have spent my whole life learning not to hope, Mr. Ashworth, and that is a difficult habit to unlearn in a single afternoon, however generous your offer to my father. I do not expect a single afternoon to undo 23 years of learned caution. I expect to earn it, slowly, for as long as it takes, and I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am entirely willing to spend however much time that requires. Something in his steady patience, so unlike the practiced ease he had shown Cordelia all those weeks ago, finally broke through the last of Meg's careful defenses, and she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowing herself to hope without immediately bracing for the disappointment that had always followed before. You may call again, Mr. Ashworth, she said quietly, properly, not to see my sister, and not merely to linger in doorways afterward hoping I might notice, openly and honestly, and for as long as it takes for both of us to trust what we feel. Julian's answering smile was unlike any Meg had seen from him before, unguarded and entirely without calculation, the smile of a man who had spent 4 years performing charm, and had finally, at considerable cost to his own pride, learned the far harder art of simple, patient sincerity. He called again 3 days later, and then twice more that week, and though the courtship that followed lacked the drama and public spectacle of his brief pursuit of Cordelia, it possessed something far more durable: quiet conversations in the garden, honest disagreements freely spoken and freely resolved, a growing trust built slowly out of 100 small, unglamorous kindnesses that no one beyond the Whitmore household ever witnessed or applauded. By the time autumn arrived and Cordelia married Lord Ellison in a ceremony attended by the whole of the county, few among the assembled guests noticed the quiet young woman standing near the back of the church, dressed simply as always, watching her sister's wedding with genuine happiness, rather than the old, familiar ache of invisibility. Fewer still noticed the steady, attentive way Julian Ashworth stood beside her throughout the ceremony, no longer performing for anyone's benefit, simply present, simply hers. It was several months later, on a quiet evening in the same garden where he had once been sent away in tears and grief, that Julian asked Meg properly to marry him, without any grand gesture or public spectacle, only a small ring and a steady voice and the same patient honesty that had, slowly and completely, finally earned her trust. The whole county will be astonished, Meg said, laughing softly through happy tears as she accepted him, the notorious Rake, finally settled, and not even for the beautiful sister. The whole county spent a season looking at the wrong Whitmore daughter, Julian said, drawing her close. I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain no one ever makes that mistake again." They married the following spring, quietly, in the same small church where Cordelia had married before them. And if the wedding lacked the grand spectacle the county had once expected from a man of Julian Ashworth's reputation, no one who attended ever doubted, watching the way he looked at his bride throughout the ceremony, that he had finally found something far more valuable than the admiration he had spent 4 careless years chasing. He had found a woman who never once tried to be seen, and had, in the end, been seen more completely than any beauty in 3 counties had ever managed. In the weeks leading up to their own wedding, Meg often thought back to that first night at Faircross Hall, when she had stood half-hidden behind a fern, watching a golden-haired sister capture the attention of a room she had never once expected to notice her. She thought of how certain she had been then, that her place in the world was fixed and unremarkable, a quiet supporting figure in someone else's brighter story, and how thoroughly that certainty had been undone by a man who had, by his own admission, arrived at Faircross Hall, intending nothing more than a season's careless amusement. She asked him once, not long before their wedding, what exactly had changed his mind that first evening, what small thing had made him look twice at a plain woman in a borrowed shawl when the whole room had eyes only for her sister. Julian considered the question seriously, turning it over the way he had learned to turn over every question concerning her, with patience rather than practiced charm. "I am not certain there was a single moment," he said finally. "I think, if I am honest, it was simply the accumulation of 100 small things I had never noticed in any other woman, because no other woman had ever given me reason to look past the surface long enough to notice them. You never once tried to impress me, Meg. You corrected me when I was wrong, teased me when I deserved it, and told me the truth even when it cost you nothing to simply flatter me instead, as everyone else in that ballroom seemed content to do. I do not think I fell in love with you despite your plainness, as the world would call it. I think I fell in love with you because you were the first person in years who never once performed for my benefit, and I found, to my own astonishment, that honesty suited me far better than admiration ever had." Meg's own family continued to flourish in the months that followed. Sir Edmund's health, freed at last from the constant worry of debt, improved steadily enough that he lived to see both his daughters settled, and to hold, eventually, grandchildren from each of their marriages, a joy he had feared, during the darkest weeks of the bank's threats, he might never live to see it all. Cordelia and Lord Ellison, whatever the practical beginnings of their match, grew genuinely fond of one another over time, their marriage settling into a comfortable, companionable warmth that surprised no one more than Cordelia herself, who had once believed passion and practicality could never coexist in the same union. The sisters grew closer too, in ways neither had expected when they were younger, Cordelia visiting often, no longer trailing admirers or gossip but simply herself, quieter now, more thoughtful, having learned, through her own quiet marriage, something of the value Meg had always understood instinctively. She confessed once, laughing over tea in Meg's own drawing room, that she had spent her whole youth believing beauty was the only currency worth having, and had needed to lose the attention of a rake she never truly loved to understand how much more lasting quiet devotion could be. As for Julian, the county never entirely stopped remarking on his transformation. From the most notorious rake in 3 counties, to a steady, devoted husband, who spoke of his wife with an open, unguarded fondness he had never shown any woman before her. He kept the small book of poetry, still, on a shelf in their shared study, its pages softer now with a second reader's use. And on quiet evenings, when the work of managing their combined households and growing family allowed it, he would often find Meg curled in her favorite chair by the fire, and settle beside her, simply to be near her. No performance required, no audience necessary, only the quiet, ordinary happiness of 2 people who had finally been seen, fully and completely, by exactly the person who mattered most. The county had spent an entire season watching Julian Ashworth chase the beautiful sister, certain they knew precisely how the story would end. None of them, not even Julian himself in those first careless weeks, had understood that his heart had already found its way to the forgotten one, quietly and completely, long before he ever had the courage to say so aloud. And Margaret Whitmore, who had spent a lifetime learning not to hope, discovered, at last, that some hopes, held quietly and patiently enough, eventually find their way home. 5 years after her wedding, Meg stood in the same garden where Julian had once been sent away in tears, watching her own daughter chase a small dog across the grass, while her husband looked on with the same quiet, unguarded fondness he had shown her since the day he finally earned her trust. The eastern farm, once a source of such desperate worry, had become the most productive land on the estate, thanks to the drainage improvements Julian had arranged all those years ago, and Sir Edmund, now frail but content, spent his afternoons in a chair by the window overlooking it, watching the crops grow with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with wealth, and everything to do with peace of mind he had not known in years. It was on one such afternoon that a young woman arrived at the house, a distant cousin of a neighboring family, newly arrived in the county for the season and clearly overwhelmed by the size and grandeur of the gatherings she had been thrust into. Meg recognized something of herself in the girl's quiet discomfort almost immediately, the careful way she hovered at the edges of conversations, the practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes, the particular exhaustion of a woman who had learned to make herself smaller so that others might feel more comfortable in her presence. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and she had come to stay with relations while her own family settled matters of business abroad, and Meg, remembering with sudden clarity her own years of quiet invisibility, made a point of drawing the girl into conversation whenever their paths crossed. "You need not stand so far back at every gathering, Miss Whitfield," Meg said gently, one afternoon when she found Eleanor hovering near the edge of a garden party much like the one where her own story with Julian had truly begun. "I promise you, the room does not require quite so much space between yourself and everyone in it." Eleanor flushed, startled to be noticed at all. "I do not mind it, Mrs. Ashworth. I have never been the sort of woman rooms turn to look at, and I made my peace with that fact a long time ago." "I once believed exactly the same thing," Meg said, settling onto a nearby bench and gesturing for the younger woman to join her. "I spent years convinced that being unremarkable meant being unworthy of notice, and I built an entire life around expecting nothing more than what I could earn through usefulness alone. It took a very long time, and a great deal of stubbornness, before I understood how wrong I had been." "What changed your mind?" Meg considered the question, watching her husband across the lawn, laughing at something Henry Colton had said, his eyes finding hers briefly across the distance the way they always did. A small, private acknowledgement that needed no words. "A man who forgot to perform when he spoke to me," she said finally. "Though I do not think you should wait for such a man to arrive before you decide your own worth, Miss Whitfield. I made that mistake myself, waiting years to be seen before I ever considered simply seeing myself clearly first. I would not wish that particular delay on anyone, however it turned out for me in the end." Eleanor absorbed this quietly, and something in her posture eased, just slightly, the careful smallness she had carried since arriving loosening by a small but noticeable degree. "The gentleman standing with your husband," she said after a moment, glancing across the lawn with poorly disguised curiosity. "The one who keeps looking this way. Who is he?" Meg followed her gaze to where a young man stood near Julian and Henry, tall and quiet, clearly more comfortable at the edges of the gathering than at its center, watching the party with the same careful, observant distance Meg herself had once perfected. "That is Mr. Nathaniel Gray," she said. "A friend of my husband's from his time at university. He inherited a struggling estate 2 counties over, and has spent the past several years working to restore it, much to the confusion of society, which cannot understand why a gentleman of his standing would rather manage his own fields than attend every ball in the county." "He does not look like a man who enjoys balls." "He does not," Meg agreed, smiling. "Which is precisely why I suspect you two might find rather more to discuss with one another than either of you will find with anyone else at this particular gathering." Eleanor blushed, though she did not look away from where Nathaniel Gray stood, and Meg, watching the small, hesitant spark of interest pass between two people who had each spent years believing themselves overlooked, felt something warm settle in her chest, a quiet echo of her own story finding its way, perhaps, toward someone new. She made the introduction herself, later that afternoon, and left the two of them to their own quiet conversation near the edge of the garden, exactly where she had once sat with Julian, discovering, slowly and against every careful instinct, that being truly seen required nothing more than someone patient enough to look properly in the first place. That evening, walking home through the garden with Julian, their daughter finally tired enough to be carried in her father's arms, Meg told him about the conversation, about Eleanor's quiet discomfort and Nathaniel's careful distance, and the small, hopeful spark she had witnessed passing between them. "You are matchmaking now," Julian said, amused, shifting their sleeping daughter more comfortably against his shoulder. "I am simply doing what someone ought to have done for me. Years ago, before I spent so many seasons convinced that being overlooked was simply my permanent condition in life." Meg slipped her hand into his free one, the gesture as natural now as breathing, after 5 years of marriage that had never once grown tiresome or predictable. "I cannot undo my own years of quiet invisibility, but perhaps I can spare someone else a portion of the same waiting." You give me far too little credit for how quickly I noticed you, that first evening at Faircross Hall, Julian said, though his tone carried no real complaint, only the easy teasing warmth that had replaced, over the years, every trace of his old practiced charm. You noticed me nearly walking into a fern, Mr. Ashworth. That is hardly the grand romantic recognition you seem to remember it as. I noticed a woman who refused to let me get away with a single careless remark, and who told me, within moments of meeting me, precisely what she thought of my behavior. I have never forgotten it, and I do not believe I ever will, however many years pass between that evening and this one. He paused at the garden gate, turning to look at her properly, the same steady honesty in his expression that had, all those years ago, finally earned her trust. I have thought, more than once, about how differently my life might have unfolded, had you not corrected me so thoroughly that first night. I might have spent this entire season, and many seasons after it, exactly as I had spent the previous 4, chasing whatever beauty caught my eye, and calling it happiness, without ever understanding how much emptier that happiness truly was, compared to what I found instead. You give the fern too little credit, Meg said, laughing softly, and he laughed with her, the sound easy and warm in the quiet evening air. And together they walked the rest of the way home, their daughter sleeping peacefully against her father's shoulder, the house ahead of them lit warmly against the gathering dusk, safe now, and settled, and entirely, completely theirs. Behind them, in the garden they had just left, Eleanor Whitfield and Nathaniel Gray remained deep in quiet conversation long after the other guests had begun to depart, each of them discovering, slowly and with the same careful astonishment Meg and Julian had once known, that being truly seen by the right person was worth every long year of waiting it sometimes required. The county would spend the coming season speculating about the quiet courtship developing between 2 of its more overlooked young people, exactly as it had once speculated about Julian Ashworth's sudden, inexplicable devotion to the forgotten Whitmore sister. Weeks later, when Nathaniel Gray called formally at the Whitfield Relations House to request permission to court Eleanor properly, the county buzzed with the same startled gossip it had once reserved for Julian Ashworth's transformation, unable to quite understand why a quiet, sensible young woman had captured the attention of a gentleman who could, by every measure of fortune and standing, have pursued far showier prospects. Meg listened to the gossip with quiet amusement, remembering how thoroughly the same whispers had once surrounded her own courtship, and how little any of it had mattered in the end, against the simple, steady truth of 2 people who had finally found each other. She wrote to Eleanor often that autumn, offering the kind of practical, gentle guidance no one had ever offered her during her own uncertain courtship, how to trust a man's quiet consistency over his practiced words, how to recognize genuine attention in the small, unglamorous gestures rather than the grand public displays society prized so highly. Eleanor's replies grew warmer and more confident with each letter, and by the time winter arrived, word reached Meg that Nathaniel Gray had proposed, quietly, in his own struggling garden, exactly as Julian once had, without any of the spectacle the county had come to expect from such announcements. Sir Edmund, delighted by the news, insisted on hosting a small dinner to celebrate the coming marriage, and the Whitmore house, once burdened by debt and desperate letters from the bank, filled that evening with warmth and laughter, in a way it had not known in years. Cordelia and Lord Ellison attended with their own 2 children in tow, and Meg watched her sister move through the gathering with an ease and genuine contentment that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier, when a hasty, necessary engagement had seemed the only solution to a crisis neither of them had known how to survive. Late in the evening, once the younger guests had retired and only the family remained by the fire, Cordelia settled beside Meg with the easy familiarity of sisters who had, over the years, finally become genuine friends. "Do you ever think of how differently it might have gone?" Cordelia asked quietly, watching her husband across the room, deep in conversation with Julian about some matter of crop rotation neither of them had cared about 5 years earlier. "If Peter had not offered when he did, if I had never accepted him, if Mr. Ashworth's feelings for you had somehow come to light before all of it happened." "Often," Meg admitted, "but I have come to believe it unfolded exactly as it needed to, however painful the middle of it felt at the time. You found something real with Peter, in your own time and your own way. I found something real with Julian, once I finally allowed myself to trust it. I do not think either of us would have arrived at such genuine happiness if events had unfolded any faster or any easier than they did." Cordelia smiled, resting her head briefly against her sister's shoulder, a gesture of simple affection that would have seemed unimaginable between them in the anxious, distant days before the bank's letters forced them finally to see each other clearly. "I am glad in the end that the whole county spent that season watching the wrong sister," she said softly. "I do not think I have ever seen you happier, Meg, than I have these past 5 years." "Nor I you," Meg said, and meant it entirely, watching her sister's husband cross the room to refill her tea without being asked, a small, quiet kindness offered without any expectation of praise. Precisely the kind of steady devotion neither sister had understood, all those years ago, could matter more than any beauty or any grand romantic declaration ever could. And so the story that the county had once been so certain it understood, the tale of a notorious rake chasing a celebrated beauty, settled finally into its true and quieter shape. A story not of pursuit and conquest, but of patience, honesty, and the slow, steady work of truly seeing another person, exactly as they were, long enough and clearly enough to recognize what had been there, waiting quietly, all along.